This section is mostly looking at the converses of the last section. These are things, if we know that these are true about some certain shapes, then we'll know for sure that they're rhombuses or rectangles or squares. So we're going to learn tests to determine whether a shape fits these different categories. Mostly we can look at the properties of diagonals if we already know that it's a parallelogram. Okay, for the first one, if we know that it's a parallelogram first, and we know that we have a right angle in that parallelogram, then it has to be a rhombus. We've already looked at this idea before. Basically, we would show that since this is a parallelogram, that each one of these triangles would be congruent, meaning that each of these inside angles would have to be a 90-degree angle. The next one would be looking at the bisecting angles there. If it's a parallelogram, and we know that the angles are the same, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, then we know it's a rhombus. Now, since it's a parallelogram, we would also know that 3 and 2 go together, which means really all 4 of these angles would be congruent to each other, which is going to make it a rhombus. We could prove those two triangles are isosceles. Okay, and the one down below, if it's a parallelogram, so everything's parallel, and we know the diagonals are congruent, AC, BD, then it has to be a rectangle. So we want to see if it's a rhombus, rectangle, or square. Now, first of all, they tell us this is a parallelogram, and that's important. Now, notice we have base angles congruent, base angles congruent. It would be enough to see there that those two triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. It would also show that these are isosceles triangles, and so all 4 of those sides are congruent, and this has to be a rhombus. The next one, we notice we have a right angle here, which if we have a right angle for the diagonals, then it's a rhombus. We can also look and notice that the diagonals, which bisect each other, since they have the same markings, they're also congruent. And so this is also a rectangle. If it's a rhombus and a rectangle at the same time, that means that this can be classified as a square. Okay, the next one, if we want this to be a rhombus, we look at what we have here. We need all of these angles to be the same, so we simply set these two angles equal to each other. This gives us 2x equals 10 and x equals 5. So if we want this to be a rectangle and the diagonals both bisect each other and are equal to each other, then all 4 of these parts would be the same. So to solve this one, all we have to do is set the parts equal to each other. That'll give us 2y and 8, or y equals 4. In this problem, what we're asked to do is create a rectangle using 2 ropes. Now, the first thing we're going to do, they're asking how we can guarantee that it's a rectangle. So the first thing, one of the properties of a rectangle is that our diagonals are congruent. So we want to get 2 ropes that are the same length. Now, we also want this to be a parallelogram, so we need to make sure that those ropes are actually bisecting each other. So we want to make sure that each part is equal, so what we need to do is find the midpoint of each of those ropes. So we find the middle of each rope, and that's where we want to make them cross. We then want to pull the ropes tight so that they're crossing at the midpoints. If we do that, the corners of our ropes, wherever they're holding them, or maybe they could stake them down into the ground, are going to form a rectangle.